Acts 18 and the Corinthians. This one is shorter. What you see on your screen, by the way, is what an ancient tent covering might have looked like. I've always pictured Paul making tents, and here we're going to be introduced to Paul's friends Priscilla and Aquila, pardon me, who also are tent makers. They meet each other in the guild. But this is a brilliant color, and I had always, kind of pictured military tents or kind of gray, drab things. But this very well might have been what Paul and Priscilla and Aquila were making for a living. In his letter to the Corinthians, Paul will say, I worked hard among you to pay my own rent, so to speak. And this is what he was doing. But let's read as Acts has it in 18:1. After this, that is after the talk with the Epicureans and Stoics on Mars Hill and all that happened in Athens, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. It's about 45 miles, about an hour's drive west of Athens. There he found a Jew named Aquila from Pontus, who had recently come from Italy along with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had ordered all Jews to leave Rome. Claudius is the emperor of Rome at the time. Paul went to see them, and because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them, and they worked together. By trade, they were tent makers. Every Sabbath, Paul would argue in the synagogue and would try to convince Jews and Greeks. Now, I want to notice a couple things as we do this. One is Claudius's edict that expelled Jews for a time from the city of Rome. And we're going to get to that in a moment. The other is Priscilla and Aquila don't get baptized here. Why is that? Well, Christianity got to Rome before it got to Corinth, apparently. We know that there was an existing, in fact, a sort of thriving church in Rome by the time Paul wrote his letter to Rome, never having been there. And so it's likely that Christianity followed the trade route to Rome and preceded even Paul's mission in Corinth, because now Priscilla and Aquila have come and may already be Christians when Paul meets them. That's an interesting thing to think. The early Christians were very mobile, and so they've come from Rome to flee the edict, according to the edict. They've landed in Corinth. Paul meets them there, and they end up fast friends and missionary partners. Okay, third thing to notice. Paul was in the habit, in Acts, he's in the habit of arguing in the synagogue before he heads off to hit the rest of the city. Now, here's where we find out about Claudius's edict. This is in a historian called Suetonius. His work is called Divus Claudius, the divine Claudius, the emperor. And it simply says, since the Jews constantly made disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, he, the emperor Claudius, expelled them from Rome. So why did Claudius throw the Jews out of Rome? Well, he saw this group that was making a ruckus about a certain Chrestus, which seems to me to mean, and has seemed to interpreters for a long time to mean, that Christians who looked like Jews and Jews who looked like Jews got into a little bit of a fracas in Rome, and the emperor had had enough of it and sent them all out. So the earlier speculation that these two are Christians already before they come has a pretty good chance of being true, that Priscilla and Aquila were Christians when Paul met them. Nice bust of Claudius in his younger days. When Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, Paul was occupied with proclaiming the word, testifying to the Jews that Messiah was Jesus. When they opposed and reviled him in protest, he shook the dust from his clothes and said to them, your blood be on your own heads. I'm innocent. From now on, I'll go to the Gentiles. Has anybody heard that before in Acts? Yeah, it's kind of become a theme in Acts, so much so that some scholars, as we've noticed along the way, believe that wherever it was, Luke's formula was to have Paul go in, whether he had sources who told him this or not. It's almost like he couldn't introduce easily Paul into a city without having him go to the synagogue and get rejected. We talked about it last week as sort of a concept of supersessionism, that Christianity was bound to try itself out on the Jews in any city, and then when they reject, go separate instead of staying within the Jewish community. All right, so then he left the synagogue and went to the house of a man named Titius Justus, a worshiper of God. His house was next door to the synagogue. You'll notice in this chapter in Acts chapter 18, we get more names in Corinth than we get anywhere else. Names are kind of hard to come by. We had Lydia in Philippi. We get Jason in Thessalonica between them, but we don't get a plethora of local names. The Rolodex that we would get from Acts is not that thick. The contact list in our apps would not be that thick, but Corinth has a lot of the ones we know. And so let's take a look. First off, this is a marker from the synagogue in Corinth, and you can kind of see these are menorahs that are on this, carved into this stone. And so archaeologists found these in Corinth and tried to place them where they think they would be, amid the ruins in Corinth and the reconstructions in Corinth. And so that is an indicator that when Luke says there's synagogue in Corinth, he's not lying. But now see what happens, because we run into a guy who is the official of the synagogue. Crispus, the official of the synagogue, reminds me of Jairus back in the Gospels. Crispus became a believer in the Lord, together with his whole household, and many of the Corinthians who heard Paul became believers and were baptized. So among the Jewish people, Paul made more inroads than he sometimes did in his startup with synagogue time. One night, the Lord said to Paul in a vision, "Do not be afraid, but speak and do not be silent. For I am with you, and no one will lay a hand on you to harm you, for there are many in this city who are my people." Remember the man from Macedonia who told Paul, "Come on over to Macedonia," in a vision when he was in Turkey. Here we have another visitation of God to embolden Paul in his ministry. He stayed there 1 year and 6 months, 18 months in Corinth. It's the longest that we see him stay except in Ephesus. So we go on to the next paragraph. When Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, which is the area in which Corinth is a region, the Jews made a united attack on Paul and brought him before the tribunal. They said, "This man is persuading people to worship God in ways that are contrary to the law." We don't know whether they meant Torah or Roman law. They just say the law. Let's see how it plays out. Just as Paul was about to speak, Gallio said to the Jews, "If it were a matter of crime or serious villainy, I'd be justified in accepting the complaint of you Jews. But since it's a matter of questions about words and names and your own law, see to it yourselves. I do not wish to be a judge of these matters." And he dismissed them from the tribunal. And then all of them seized Sosthenes, the official of the synagogue, and beat him in front of the tribunal. But Gallio paid no attention to any of these things. Notice what's happened here. Remember in Philippi just minutes ago, remember that the Christian missionaries, these Christian preachers, Paul and his entourage, are grouped together in public perception with the Jews. All of them are in one bucket. There's no differentiation between, quote, Christian and Jew. So the crowd gets riled up in Philippi because somebody said these Jews are carrying on. And they were talking about Paul and the people, right? Paul and his entourage. Here we have the Jews in Corinth trying to separate the two, trying to make it clear to Gallio, these guys aren't us. These guys are doing something else than our good synagogue. But Gallio will have nothing of it. He just blots it all together and says, this is up to you all to solve. It's not Roman law that's being violated. It's up to you. It's a religious internal matter, which is kind of the way the Romans handled things. If you didn't get out of hand, it didn't matter that much to them. So he dismissed them from the tribunal, and then they beat up on Sosthenes for a bit, and the episode ends.